Now I'd like to take a photograph that needs to be done in HDR. There was the inside of the Baptist church, the Primitive Baptist Church. And what I'm going to do, I'm in HDR Effects Pro, Nick's wonderful software, and I've opened up on the desktop and I found my files. So I simply highlight all of those files and say open. And it's going to open the files, and it's going to take a few minutes to load the files. And when this finishes, we will take a look at what it's giving us. Okay, it's analyzed all the photographs. It has checked all of them, and it's put them together, and we're at the first step in making a HDR photograph in Effects Pro, which is the Nick program that I'm starting to use and really like a lot. One of the really cool things, this photograph, of course, you have very good detail inside the church, but you can see that outside the windows is pretty bright. And usually in an HDR photograph, you have some detail out here as well as inside. At the very top of the control panel, you see something that says tone compression. If you take that slider and push it to the right, you will start to pick up more detail through the windows. And that's really about all I want right there. So I'm going to leave it at that. Now you can work on exposure. Let's say that you think the overall photograph is, a little on the bright side. It wouldn't be that bright inside. So let's knock the exposure down. Takes a little bit longer because it's working on such a lot of information. That was a little too much. I'm going to bring it back up just a little here. Okay, contrast is okay. Saturation actually is a little heavy, so we could pull our saturation back to make this look a little more natural, look a little more like the actual color of the wood. There you go, that's getting closer. I think we're good on blacks and whites, which is another way of dealing with contrast. And the warmth, we took some of that out when we did the saturation. Now we've got it on the natural setting. Over on the other side, you'll see a whole series of photographs, so you can choose a particular kind of effect that you want. This is kind of what's called realistic, a little more like an actual photograph. But you can go in here and do some things that are a little different. Here is one called Vibrant Textures. We're going to go ahead and try that and see what happens. And it's processing it now. And it simply went back to that super bright, which we had gone away from. You got a lot more texture and a lot more detail, but let's go back to the default setting. And remember that we need to set our compression back because we just reset it by doing that. We were up to about somewhere around 65%, 64%. Okay, that looks good, and it reset everything, so we're going to pull our saturation down again, just a little. And we're going to pull our exposure down again just a little so that the inside exposure is a little darker. Now, you can simply, at this point, you can simply save image as, and let's call it, put it back in the HDR folder. Let's call it church. And let's save it into that folder. And it's going to save the image. It's going to put it back in the folder where all of the other photographs were. And we'll open that in a minute, and you can see where it placed it. And you can also see, what the other 9 photographs. This was made from 9 single exposure shots. I'm going to minimize this to the side real quick. Here's the HDR folder. And there are all of the images that we used, the 9 one-stop differences, and here is the HDR image at the bottom. The reason that we do this is if we shoot dark enough to get exposure in the windows, then of course everything inside the church is going to turn black because you're exposing for outdoors and you're inside a church. There's a huge amount of difference. As you can see, the windows look natural, but inside the church you've lost everything. Well, now if we were to go with an exposure that gives us a pretty good example of what's in the church, let's put that one in Photoshop and compare them here. You would get good detail in here, but you've lost the windows. Once again, too dark exposure, you get out the windows. very light exposure or enough exposure to get the inside of the church, these windows blow out. What we did by putting the whole thing into HDR, let's grab the final product and let's compare that to the other two. We're going to put it back in Photoshop. Now we're going to have 3 images in here to compare. HDR is really a unique way to do this, to get a realistic looking photograph, and it's also great to use with the art filters. That's a little gritty looking there, but that's after you combined them. Remember, that's the dark with detail in the windows but none in the church. There's plenty of detail in the church, but the windows are blown out. And here is all of it put together. Now you can further refine this photograph in Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever other program you want to use to tame the contrast, to add color, to deepen tones. And with Capture NX2, you can even go in and just work on certain areas. But that is a cool way to get a photograph that before HDR we couldn't even make.